Welcome to another sustainability and resilience virtual gathering. This time, Dan's going to be talking about taking care of your summer crops. Tyler, you need to unmute. Perfect. And we're going to get started in just a second. We're lucky the weather is cooperating with us today. And we want to welcome everybody. We're going to try something a little bit different this time. Instead of taking all of the questions in chat, I welcome you to either raise your hand or send me a chat message to unmute you, and we'll have folks go ahead and ask their questions themselves, just because it's a small enough group, and we love it when people engage. So go ahead and give that a try. Otherwise, also feel welcome to send the question in the chat, and we'll be asking Dan questions as we move along. So I'm going to turn it over to Dan. Thank you, Dan. And Tyler's there recording, and we're going to go ahead and see what he's got on that tray.
All right, thank you, Kathy. Good morning, everybody. Hope everyone is having a wonderful summer, enjoying this nice warm weather. And so today we're going to be talking about summer crops. So we're going to look around, see what's happening here, and hopefully you'll walk away getting a sense of what you can be doing to really get the most benefit out of your garden right now, as well as making sure that you're planning ahead for the fall and even into the winter time. But let's start with where I am right now. So I've just been picking some calendula. These are the yellow and the orange flowers. And I also have some echinacea flowers, which I picked off. And the reason I'm doing that, well, for one thing is we actually use both of these medicinally. The calendula we dry and then infuse into oil that will then be made into salves and lotions. And the echinacea we dry and then make into tea and tinctures and various ways that we can prevent cold and flu. But I'm also doing another thing when I'm doing this, which is I'm deadheading. And that's a really important activity this time of year if you're interested in maximizing flower production. So if you're growing cut flowers or anything that you want to have for a long period of time in its flowering phase, now is a really important time to be deadheading, which is essentially when you pull a flower when it's either at its peak or maybe even slightly after its peak, so that that plant doesn't then go to seed. Rather, it will continue to flower. So when I'm picking this calendula, not only am I getting a really good harvest, but I'm also making sure that these plants are going to continue flowering for hopefully many months. And we love our calendula not only because of its medicinal value, but also because it brings in so many beneficial insects. So we really want it to be in its flowering stage. So whether you have roses, or any other ornamental flowers, consider giving them a quick deadhead this time of year. If you go out for 5 minutes every few days or once a week even, you'll really be able to extend that flowering phase. So let me put this down. We're going to be mostly focusing on vegetables and fruits today. Let me just put this over here. And I want to make sure that I get to any questions that you all have. And otherwise, we're going to talk about a lot of the crops that we have here. So I want to start with kind of just a general overview of what this time of year represents. So we are just after solstice. Summer solstice was June 21st. So now the days are getting shorter, and it's already starting to be a bit noticeable. And what that really means for me is that as a gardener, plants are starting to shift away from vegetative growth, where they're putting on a lot of green leaves and stems and shoots, and they're moving towards flowering fruit production and sometimes even seed production at this point. So that's really the major shift that's happening. And there's a reason actually why this particular full moon that happens to come in July, we just passed it, I believe it was Sunday, so just a few days ago. In the Iroquois, for Iroquois Native people, this was the raspberry moon. And so that gives you a sense that this is the time of year when fruit is really starting to come in. I'll show you some of our blueberries and our currants in a little bit. So you'll get to see what's fruiting right now. And we'll also talk about what we're putting in the ground right now. So we're actually going to end by seeding some summer squash, zucchini, and cilantro today to give you a sense of what you can be planting right now from seed. We'll talk about the way that we do that. So we'll do it from beginning to end. And hopefully you'll get a sense of what you can be doing in the few weeks ahead, whether you have a very small garden of just a few square feet or even a few pots, or a large multi-acre garden. So with that, let's start with our tomatoes, because I bet that it's probably the most common plant that most of us as vegetable growers are working with. Certainly one of the reasons I got into growing vegetables was because I absolutely adore fresh tomatoes. And I adore them to the point where I honestly cannot buy grocery store tomatoes out of season anymore. They just don't satisfy me in the way that fresh tomatoes do. So my personal philosophy is gorge when something is fresh and in season to the point where you won't want to eat it for the entire rest of the year. So that's what I'm trying to do with tomatoes. We're growing a lot of tomatoes in here this year. So let's look at some of them over here. We've got a few different spots. So we're going to look at some of our different varieties. We'll talk about some of the different ways that we're caring for our tomatoes this time of year. So here are some of our tomatoes. This is a cherry tomato variety. I believe these are called Peace Vine. We have a lot of different heirloom tomatoes. And what I want to talk about in terms of tomatoes is staking, trellising, and feeding them. Those are kind of the main things. And as we'll also talk about pruning tomatoes as well. A lot of growers, you know, they put tomatoes in the ground, they start doing really well. And roughly this time of year, they might start to notice that their tomatoes are either starting to get a little bit diseased. Some of them might notice that there's some blossom end rot on the very first tomatoes. I'll talk about what that means in a little bit. So what we can be doing right now is really starting to balance our plants. So with tomatoes, what that means is we're going to be removing a lot of the leaf growth and really promoting fruit growth, because that's really what we're after. We're not trying to grow tomato leaves after all. We're trying to grow some fruit. So let's talk about staking. Actually, let's talk about feeding first. So I know a lot of folks, they put their fertilizer in the ground in the early spring or whenever they're planting, and then they put their plants in. And that's all well and good. But I've had great benefit from doing 1 or 2 additional feeds for tomatoes and other heavy feeding crops roughly this time of year. So just as they're really kind of getting going with their fruit production, and then even into, you know, later on in their fruit production as well. So we generally feed our tomatoes once every couple weeks, starting early July and going more or less until they've kind of done fruiting. So that for us will be sometime usually in September, sometimes even into October. So again, if you don't have time to feed them every few weeks, that's fine. You don't have to feed them at all and they'll do fine, but you'll get more fruit, bigger fruit, and very importantly, tastier fruit if you give them a little bit of nutrition. Now, it's important that you don't just give them annual fertilizer though. So at this time of year, because they are no longer, we're not looking for that vegetative growth, we don't want to give them much in the way of nitrogen. Nitrogen, also often referred to as just N, if you see it on a package, that is what promotes vegetative growth. That's great to give them in the springtime when you really want them to grow fast. But this time of year, if you give them extra nitrogen, first of all, they'll just grow more leaves, not very good. And it can actually promote certain pests like aphids that are attracted to excessive nitrogen in a lot of plants. So we don't want to give them that. We give them one of 2 things usually this time of year. We often give them comfrey tea. And I want to show you how we make our comfrey tea and how we give it to our tomato plants. We also offer it to a lot of our other fruiting plants. So that would be our peppers, our eggplant, our cucumbers, tomatillos. You can give them to winter squash. Anything that's in flower or fruit stage, it's a great time to be offering comfrey tea. We grow a lot of comfrey in this garden because it's a very useful plant. And I want to show you that process. So come with me as I show you our comfrey. We're going to pick some, start a batch, and I'm going to show you a batch that's already finished, and we're going to put it on our tomatoes. So right over here, it might be a little hard to see. It's a bit in the shade. Let me cut some so I can get it in the sun for you all. But some of you might be familiar with this plant. It's a perennial. It's incredibly easy to grow. And we're able to cut this plant right down to the ground about 3 or 4 times a year and use it either in our compost as mulch or more specifically as compost tea in this case. You can see it's got these beautiful purple flowers, which you can, by the way, you can eat them. They taste like cucumber. Bumblebees also absolutely adore these flowers. And it's a great feed. It's fairly heavy in potassium and calcium, both of which are essential nutrients for that fruiting stage. So look, if you're going to give them any kind of feed, whether it's comfrey tea or some of the others that we'll talk about, look for something that is low in nitrogen and high in potassium. That's the most important thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut some of this up, just right into a 5-gallon bucket. Cut a little more. See? I'm cutting that plant right to the ground, and it will regrow just fine. Very hardy plant. So I'm going to stuff that in. Now, I'm going to, for the sake of this video, I'm not going to fill this up, but usually I would fill up this entire bucket, really pack it in, and then we're going to fill it with water. Then it's going to sit for a few weeks. So let me go ahead and fill it up a little bit. Okay, so I'm just going to make a half batch now. Usually I'd make a full bucket, but this essentially just now needs to ferment for usually about 2 weeks. And warning, it's going to get extremely smelly when you open it. And that's just kind of par for the course. It's only smelly for a little bit. It's not too bad if you get it early. So if it's too smelly for you, just ferment it a little bit less, maybe a week. You let it sit for a really long time, it does get smellier. But it's such good food, and it's free, and it's extremely easy to make. And it'll make your tomatoes bigger, more luscious, more productive, and tastier. So I think it's totally worth it. This is just going to have a lid on it at this point, and it's going to sit somewhere out of the way for a week or 2. It can be in the shade or direct sun, doesn't matter too much. Now here's a batch that has been sitting for a couple weeks now. You can see it's pretty brown and looks kind of gross. So what we're going to do now, we're going to filter this out. And actually, you know what? This batch doesn't even smell that bad. Sometimes it can be pretty bad. So I have a bucket here with holes in it. That's going to act as a sieve to get the plant material out. I'm going to put this into another bucket, and I'm going to pour it right on through. There it goes. You can see it's kind of a nice, almost a Gatorade yellow, I would describe it. So I'm going to go ahead and get all that good stuff out of there. All of that comfrey that's left in there, that could just go into the compost or as a mulch under some plants, whatever you want to do with it. Okay? Later. So at this point, this is a concentrated food that we can be giving to our fruiting and flowering plants. Now, we want to dilute this roughly 10-to-1 with water. So I'm going to just eyeball it. Okay. And then I'm just going to fill that up the rest of the way with some water. There you go. That is comfrey tea. And I'm going to apply it to the root zone and really drench it. Now, ideally, I wouldn't be doing it in the middle of the day like right now. This is not a great time to be watering in general. I would ideally want to water really early in the morning or later in the afternoon, because what I'm really trying to do is get these plants to absorb as much of this as possible. So this is not a great time, but you get the idea. And I'm giving them a thorough watering. I want it to go deep in the root zone you give them a shallow water, you're not going to really drench those plants. They're not going to be able to really absorb much. So you want to go really heavy. Pour the rest of that out. And that's really going to get them craving for fruiting flowers. All right, beautiful. So that's one of my favorite feeds this time of year for all the fruiting plants. If you don't have that, the other thing you can consider is, this is actually, so this is a fish fertilizer. This is actually slightly different. I think what you really like to get, it's actually the same brand. This is not the product I recommend, but look for a seaweed fertilizer or a fish and seaweed fertilizer. They make a lot of variations. So this is fish. It's a little bit higher. It's a little higher in nitrogen and lower in potassium than ideally you'd want. But if you get the seaweed variation, that's really going to be high in potassium. It's also going to have a lot of other micronutrients that it's great for your tomatoes and your other fruiting plants. So again, seaweed fertilizer, not so much the fish. This is better for earlier growing plants that are still in their vegetative phase. So
Dan,
that's,
are
yeah.
there other plants that you can make tea out of? Like I'm thinking about nettle maybe?
Yes. Yeah, we make tea out of a few other plants, nettle being one of them. They all have slightly different nutritional profiles. So nettle is higher in nitrogen. So I think of nettle as more of a vegetative producer, right? Helps with that green growth. So you can use others as well. In fact, if you're interested in this, I would recommend looking into biodynamic preparations. There's a whole field of study that really looks at how plants can support each other in our gardens. So there's a lot of different plants that are utilized, everything from valerian to even animal products like horns and certain types of manure that are aged in certain ways. It can be a bit esoteric, but there's a lot to gain from studying some of those preparations. So if you're interested, check out biodynamic farming or gardening. You'll find a lot of resources.
Great, thanks.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about how to make sure we can really get the most tomatoes in this small space, which really means that we have to do a great job of staking, trellising, and pruning. So let's come on over to one of our other tomato patches, and we're going to do some trellising and some pruning together. So one thing that's important to note about tomatoes is that there are two basic groups of tomatoes. There's the determinate tomatoes, and then there's the indeterminate tomatoes. Determinate tomatoes means that they'll get to a certain height, and then they just stop growing, and then they put all their energy into fruiting and flowering. Those are usually your paste tomatoes, so like ones that you would make sauce out of. And then there are others as well. Most heirlooms and cherry tomatoes, most of those are indeterminate tomatoes, which means that they'll keep growing and growing and growing until it gets too cold for them or they run out of energy. So those are the ones that it's really essential to stake and trellis well. The determinate ones, I still prefer to stake and trellis them, but some people just sort of let them go right on the ground because they don't get very long, they don't get very tall, but definitely indeterminate tomatoes, which are most of our heirlooms, most of the tomatoes that we're probably going to be growing, those you definitely want to get going upright, right? So tomatoes are vines. If you let them just grow without any support, they will grow on the floor. They'll take up a ton of space, and they'll be much more susceptible to rotting because the fruits will be right on the ground. They'll be, surrounded by rain and soil. Wildlife will be able to come and easily access them and bite them. So you really definitely want them to be growing upright. So this bed right here, these are our Sun Gold cherry tomatoes. It's a wonderful variety. If you've never grown them, they're an orange cherry tomato, an heirloom, which means that you can easily save seed from them. Just so delicious, pure candy in my opinion. And these guys grow vigorously. So we want to be staking them. Our method here in this bed, it's a little different from the one you just saw, is to use tomato seeds, which you can get at almost any garden store, probably a lot of hardware stores. It's an oak stake, and I like to put them in every 3 plants. So that's the absolute minimum. Some people even put them every 2 plants or even next to every plant. Now, so they get expensive after a while. So if you have a lot of tomatoes, you don't want to put them next to every plant. But these will be heavy plants. So definitely every 3 plants is the least that you'd want to put in. Now, we've already tied these tomatoes twice. And I want to show you our process for doing that, because if you can do this ahead of time, then you're going to be really, really doing well with your tomatoes. A lot of folks, unfortunately, wait till it's too late. And at that point, it's really tough to tie in your tomatoes. And in general, this is the time of the summer when you want to be thinking about supporting your plants, by which I mean physical supports. Right? So a lot of even our perennial flowers might start to be drooping. For example, if you have hollyhocks growing, they might start to really be falling. So before they even start to tip over, you want to be supporting them in some way, tying them in with something. Anything at all will really, really help. So I'm going to tie these. My general rule of thumb is that I want to tie them between wherever they were last attached, or the ground, wherever that may be, and their full height. So halfway in between there is what I'm aiming for. So I'm gonna just attach this with a simple knot. All right. I'm actually just using regular cotton twine here. I prefer hemp twine or jute twine, but this is cheap and this is what I found. So use whatever you can get. Okay, so now what I want to do is just go along, and I'm sort of sweeping down. So I want to pick up as much of that growth as possible. And then I just want to go around each post. And that's about halfway. And I'm pulling a little bit, not too tight, because I'm not trying to constrain them to be completely upright. I just want to support them. Okay? Just like a good partner would do. You just want to support, you don't want to smother, right? So go around again. Lower. You don't want to be damaging your plant. It's really easy to damage the stems, and that's a no-no, because you're going to be inviting in disease if you try to damage your stems too much. And in general, I recommend doing this process on sunny days. If it's really wet, again, you're going to be potentially inviting in fungal disease. It can be a real problem. Late blight is the major disease issue with tomatoes. That usually comes in August, late July, fungal disease. And that's what's responsible also for potato blight, which, as we may know, was responsible for the Irish famine. So I've gone through one side. In general, I would go through both sides. I would just swoop right back around, but for the sake of this demo, I'm going to tie this off right here. Go ahead and cut that. Fine. And
so Dan, tell me again how often you do it, and kind of how the twine is spaced.
Yeah, great question. So in terms of how often, it really depends on how fast your plants are growing. So some plants are going to be growing much faster. If they start to really lean out, that's when you know it's time. Ideally, you want to be ahead of it. So I like to do this in the summer. So I think the first time I tied it in was probably maybe mid to late June, 3rd week of June, usually the first one that I would do. And then at that point, it's every 2 weeks until really they don't, either you run out of space to tie them in, because these tomatoes will get taller than these trellises eventually. At that point, I won't have any way of tying them, or until they really stop growing. So one of the two, but you do want to do this roughly every 2 weeks, but the plants usually will tell you when it's time. And again, so the rule of thumb is that you want to space your stakes every 3 plants. You just push it in, and you can either use a rock, something like this, or you can have, we have a special tool that will knock it in. You really want to make sure it's nice and in there, really, really steady in the ground. It's not enough just to stick it in with your hand. You got to knock it in with a hammer or mallet or rock, and put them right in between, and then just go right along the sides, swooping. As you can see here, we just go around the post, and all it's doing is it's supporting these plants from leaning over too much.
Great. How
And
tall were the stakes?
these stakes are, I believe these are 6-foot stakes. We also use some 5-foot stakes. So ideally, I would say the taller the better. 6 foot is the tallest that you'll find of the wooden stakes. And when you drive them in, they'll only be about 5 feet tall. That's really the minimum that I think of, especially for tall tomatoes like cherry tomatoes. But if you can get even taller ones, great, because they will get taller than 5 feet for sure. Great question. Any other questions or ideas around trellising and supporting tomatoes? There are definitely other ways, I should mention. You may have seen earlier by those other tomatoes that we also sometimes use metal cages that will go around individual plants. Honestly, those are not my favorite. First of all, the metal cages are expensive. I don't think that they do as great of a job of supporting the plants, but the advantage is you stick it in once, and after that, you more or less leave the plants alone. So it's a bit of a personal taste.
Any other questions right now before he moves on? All right, keep going.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, so I'm going to show you guys how I prune tomatoes as well. So now that we've tied them in, first of all, I want to say that I have not done a fantastic job of pruning these tomatoes because tomatoes grow fast, and if you get busy, sometimes you get carried away. This is the time of year also when it's important to take a step back and enjoy the garden, and sometimes that means that some pests get away from us. That's okay. Don't beat yourself up over it. Certainly happens here, and we're out here all the time. But if you are getting ahead of it, it's great because you're going to be able to really maximize the health and vigor of your plants and their productivity. So the basic rule of thumb with tomatoes, and this is most important with your large heirloom or slicing tomatoes, less important with the cherries, although I do it for all tomatoes if I can, is to prune foliage that is going to be on the very bottom of the plant. So anything below the lowest fruiting cluster, any green leaves can be taken off, or yellowing leaves can be taken off. So that's one thing that I'm trying to do. I'm also going to be removing any diseased growth, which I will know is diseased because it's going to be off color, maybe yellow or brown or wilty. And lastly, I'm going to remove any suckers that are really leaning out and going to be creating a problem for harvesting later on. Now, when I say sucker, it's important that we get a sense of what we're talking about. So maybe Tyler, if you can get a shot here real close. What a sucker basically is it's a stem that grows out of the armpit of the tomato. So this, let me see. Okay, so maybe I'll show you guys. Okay, this is actually a better example. Can you all see this? This is the main stem here. This is the leaf right here. And in between the main stem and the leaf is this armpit. And in that armpit, there's a sucker. I'm going to take that off with my fingernails. Comes off really easily. So if I left this sucker on, this would become another stem. And that's kind of how the plant tends to grow naturally. If you want a really tall plant, you want to remove as many suckers as possible because those suckers will be growing out for the most part. So if you want lots of vertical growth, you want to remove suckers. If you let the suckers grow really long, then you're going to be really sapping a little bit of energy from the plant. So for example, this is a sucker right here on the bottom. It's a big one. It's already got flowers on it too. So it's going to be fruiting fairly soon. So I have to decide, do I want to keep this or not? In this case, I could keep it, but you know what? There's so much vegetative growth on these tomatoes. I don't feel too bad about cutting some of this out. I'm going to snip this right to the bottom, which is where it came from. So this is a sucker that came right from the bottom of the plant. You can see that's a lot of growth. I usually don't want to remove suckers this big, but this one was leaning out to the pathway, so I'm going to take that out. I'm also going to remove some of these other ones that are towards the bottom, and I'm going to start to remove some of the leaves that are along the very bottom of the plant. Now, the reason that I remove the leaves is a few things. For one thing is it really opens up the bottom of the plant to air circulation, which is really going to make a difference when it gets wet, because again, fungal disease is the main enemy of tomato plants. That's what often kills them if they're going to be killed early. So I really want to make sure that there's good airflow. That's the best prevention. So that means removing a lot of lower vegetative growth. And really importantly, that those lower leaves are no longer really serving much of a purpose for this plant. Almost all the photosynthetic activity is happening on the upper half of the plant. So anything on the bottom there is sort of vestigial at this point. It's not doing much. It's actually kind of a drain. So I'm going to take those off. I like to clip them off with pruners, and I'll take them off right to where they meet the main stem. You can also do this with your fingers, by the way. They do come off pretty easily for the most part. But however you choose to do it, make sure you do a nice, even job, and make sure you do this on a dry day, because you certainly don't want to be increasing the opportunities for fungus to get in. So it's a pretty big job, because I haven't done this in quite a while. So I'm just going to go through taking off a bunch of these guys on the bottom. It's going to take a little while, but it really is worth it. And if you only have a few plants, I would absolutely do this. I would do it fairly regularly. And as the fruits, as they start to mature, you'll go higher and higher. So again, the rule of thumb is that you want to prune everything off below the lowest fruiting cluster. So wherever your fruiting cluster might be, let's say it's right here. You can see there's some cherry tomatoes forming. Actually, that's not the lowest one here, but if it was, I would literally remove all of the growth below that, all of the leaves, all of the suckers, if I wanted to remove the suckers. And that really would help that plant out. As the plants started to, those lowest fruiting clusters are going to be the first to ripen. Once they're done fruiting, I'll continue to go higher and higher up the plant. So eventually the bottom of the plant here will be pretty bald, because I'll have removed almost all the leaves. And that's really what you want, because that's helping the plant fruit well and stay healthy, especially into August, which tends to be the month when there's a lot of dampness in the air. So that's a few thoughts on pruning. Again, is it essential? No, but it will definitely help your plants survive longer and fruit better and bigger. And if you have a small area, it also means that you can really get your plants closer together. So if you are not going to do this, I would space tomatoes 2 or even 3 feet apart. If you are pruning them, you can get them as close as 18 inches. So it means that you can get more production in a small space. Any questions about tomatoes before we move on and talk about some of the other exciting plants we have growing right now and how we're taking care of them? Great. So let's come on over and take a look at our potatoes. Actually, before we do that, let me just show you as we're walking by. These are our tomatillos. You can see the pods on here. They're just starting to fill out. I can feel them in there, but these are not going to be ripe for another 2 to 4 weeks. But we treat them just like tomatoes. If you've never grown tomatillos before, excuse me, they're extremely easy to grow, extremely vigorous. You can see this. This was planted, I believe, the 2nd or 3rd week of June. So this plant is only 3 weeks in the ground. It was started in a greenhouse, so it wasn't started from seed 3 weeks ago, but nonetheless, it was only about this tall, grown so fast. Incredible plant, makes the best salsa mix.
Dan?
Yeah.
Can you grow tomatoes like in buckets?
Absolutely. Tomatoes are great to grow in buckets. I would say a minimum of a 5-gallon bucket, and in terms of having enough soil to really have a good root mass. And very importantly, if you're going to be using a bucket, it becomes even more important to feed and water regularly. Buckets are going to dry out fast. You really need to water them every week, even better 2 to 3 times a week. So if you aren't able to do that, there are self-watering containers that you can either make or buy. You definitely want to make sure that there's even moisture, and you want to be offering some kind of a fertilizer every few weeks. That can either be the seaweed fertilizer, or it could be comfrey tea. Those are 2 really good sources. because otherwise you just don't have enough fertility unless you're using an absolutely massive container. But definitely tomatoes are a fantastic container plant to be growing. Yeah.
Great. And would you prune them the same way?
I would, yes, I would. And just make sure again that you have a stake. So if it was a container, I would have one stake that was going to be nice and tall. I might even have a twine that goes up to maybe a balcony or something, because they are going to grow really tall. The more height you can give them, the better off you'll be, because you're going to get more tomatoes. Absolutely.
Great. Is it too late in the season to start a bucket?
It is right at the edge. If you start them right now, by which I mean transplanting, definitely cannot start them from seed at this point. It's too late for that.
Okay.
If you transplant a good-sized tomato, then you should be able to still get some fruit at the end of the season. So that, by which I mean late September and into October. So that means that you're not going to get a lot of weeks of production, but you will still probably get 2 to 4 weeks at the end of the season.
Great.
By the way, if anyone is close to Route 9 in Hadley, this morning I stopped by Hadley Garden Center. I think it's now called Gardener's World, Gardener Center. They were giving away free tomato plants this morning to anyone who came by. I don't know if they still have them, but as of this morning they did, and they were a nice size. So stop by or give them a call if you're interested.
Great.
So let's talk about potatoes for a minute. These are our potatoes. We've got a lot of varieties of late fall potatoes, by which I mean that they're storage potatoes. You could eat them as new potatoes, and we are probably going to leave these until the fall, after they kind of die down after a frost, to dig them up. But potatoes, the most important thing to do for your potatoes right now is to hill them up. And I'm going to show you a few ways that we're trying to do that this year. We're trialing 2 different ways. This is more of a standard bed. So we planted these, the latest we've ever planted our potatoes. We planted these in mid-June, so less than a month ago. Usually we would be planting these in late April. So very, very late this year, because almost every company was out of stock or was late in shipping their potatoes. Nonetheless, you can see they're growing really, really well. They look really healthy. And what we did this week was we hilled them up. So what we mean by that is we added some compost, but you can use soil or mulch, and we added something to cover the bottom of the plant. And let me explain why we do that. So potatoes tend to grow fairly close to the surface of the soil. They are tubers, they're storage units, essentially. They're full of carbohydrates for the plant. And if they're really close to the surface, some of you probably have had some green potatoes before. Those green potatoes are caused by light exposure near the surface. So by hilling them up, what we're essentially doing is we're burying those potatoes near the surface so that they're not exposed to light, so that they don't get that greenness. Because that greenness is actually poisonous in large amounts to people. We don't want that. We're also covering the stem, which actually means that we're going to be converting some stem to root. Anywhere where we cover is going to turn to root eventually, and that means that we're going to have more places where potatoes can grow. And by adding compost or soil, we're also giving them a nice fertility boost that will last for months and months. Now, if you don't have compost, don't sweat it. All you need to do is just come through either by hand or with a tool and just put some soil around the base, just like I'm doing now. So you could do this with a hoe, you could do this with a shovel, whatever you do, just get some right around the stem, and they'll be very, very happy, and you'll have more good potatoes in late summer and fall whenever you choose to dig them up. Now, that's one way of doing it. We're also trialing a no-dig potato bed. Let me show you how we're doing that. This is the first year we're trying this, but we generally are trying to minimize the amount of soil disturbance that we do in our garden, which means that we want to avoid tilling the soil and digging more than necessary. Because when you dig, what you're really doing is you're exposing weed seeds to the surface, and you're disrupting soil life. So the more that we could get away with not digging, the better. So in this bed here, what we're trying to do is to grow potatoes above the surface of the soil. What we did, again, mid-June or so, we went through and we just put some potato tubers right on the surface of the, right on the ground, and we put a scoop of compost on top, just maybe one shovelful, and we mulched the whole thing with straw. And now, as it's growing, we're adding lots and lots of straw or hay mulch or leaf mulch. It's kind of, this is a mix of everything from last year, actually. This is kind of half decayed already, but that's great because all we really want to do is cover up a good portion of this plant so that we can get potatoes growing. Anywhere where it's covered, we might get potatoes, which means that in the fall, we're not going to have to dig down to get our potatoes. We're just going to have to literally remove the mulch and gather our potatoes right out of it. So I'm
And
extremely excited to see that. Yeah.
how do you know when potatoes are ready?
Great question. There are different kinds of potatoes. They're usually categorized as either early, mid, or late potatoes. Now, honestly, you can grow early potatoes and harvest them late, so there's a lot of leeway there. It's really up to you. So you can harvest potatoes really starting in, I would say, mid-July. That's the earliest. Those are going to be your baby potatoes. In August, you'll get some beautiful new potatoes, which don't store for very long at all, but are delicious, sweet, thin skinned, so yummy. And then if you harvest them later, the latest you can really harvest them anytime before the ground freezes because these plants will die with the first frost. And at that point, we'll just remove the plants, we'll put them in our compost bin, and the potatoes will just sit there in the soil. And in fact, that actually helps cure them. So if you do want to store potatoes, you want to let them sit in the soil after the potato plants die for a few weeks. That's going to harden up the skin and increase their storage life significantly. So there's really no hard rules. Anytime after mid-July, you can harvest them, but just know that obviously the longer they're in the ground, the bigger the potatoes, the more potatoes. But there's nothing like harvesting potatoes and eating some baby potatoes at a barbecue in the middle of summer. So I like to eat them really anytime after mid-July on. So maybe try out some different strategies and see what you like.
So is it something that you can just kind of dig up a few as the season progresses?
Absolutely. Yep. Yeah, just dig them up. Whenever you're hungry for potatoes, dig them up and leave the rest and they'll keep growing. So it's extremely great in terms of food security. First of all, there's really very few plants that I can think of. I think potatoes are pretty much the most calories you can grow per square foot or per acre. So they're really going to feed you, and they're going to feed you for months and months and months. So they're a great plant to have around.
Great, thanks.
Any questions on potatoes before we move on? I want to talk about some of our fruits.
Any other questions right now about potatoes or tomatoes? I think let's move on.
All right. So real quick, I want to show you some of the fruits and what's happening here. So a lot of our fruits are starting to size up really well. These are our Asian pears. And you can see these trees are absolutely loaded. They're about the size of golf balls. The main thing I want to get across in terms of fruits is if you got fruit trees that are in the pear apple family or in the peach, nectarine, apricot family, you want to thin those out so that you don't have too many fruits on any tree. A good rule of thumb is you want to have one fruit for every 4 to 6 inches of stem. Because if you have more than that, your fruits are going to be smaller and they're going to be less sweet. And next year, you'll have less fruit. So I know it's hard to pull fruits off before they're ready, but trust me, it's worth it, okay? So that's all I'll say on that topic. And I want to really quickly show you, I want to show you some of our currants because we have been picking currants all week long. And my God, they are so yummy right now. I'll show you one of our currants that's loaded. So currants are a super easy plant to grow. You can see on there, they look like little gems. They come in red, white, and pink varieties and black. We have all colors here. That's a white variety. I believe we have some reds that I can show you as well, and some blacks. Let's see if I can hear red over here. Really yummy. One of my favorite jams. Really high in pectin, so they gel really well. Oh, here's a red one over here. By the way, notice that these are understory plants. We're growing in the shade of a fruit tree, and they don't bind at all. Look at that. There's our red currant. Look at those beautiful, beautiful racemes, just absolutely gorgeous berries. And we've done almost nothing to this plant. We haven't given it any fertilizer. We pruned it once in the winter. Took us about 5 minutes. That was it. So check out some currants if you've never grown them before. Great plant. So I want to end by planting some zucchini and summer squash with you all, because this is a great time of year to be really putting in the last of our summer crops. And it's also a great time to start to plant for our fall crops. So in terms of summer crops, your options are starting to get limited. This is, as I mentioned, the very last week, I would say, that you would want to consider planting tomatoes, peppers, or eggplant from transplant. And even then, it's borderline. But certainly, you can still be planting basil. You can still be planting sunflowers. You can be planting cucumbers. So all of those are great, great options right now. We're going to be planting some zucchini and summer squash in a moment in a bed that was covered in kale until about 2 days ago. We picked it all, cut it down to the ground. Now we're going to put in some seed, and this is going to be up in no time. So let me show you our process for putting in some direct seeded zucchini and summer squash. Now, first of all, let me show you what we're going to be planting. Got the seeds in my pocket here. Pick these up at the local garden store. So we've got some Costata Romanesco summer squash. It's a beautiful heirloom variety from Italy. We have Gold Rush, which is a hybrid squash, extremely productive. And we have some Black Beauty, which is another heirloom zucchini. All really vigorous plants, extremely fast. These are about 50 days from seeding to harvest. So that means if I seed it today, these should be ready for harvest in, let's see, late August, and they will crank through September, and they should probably stop fruiting sometime late September, maybe early October at the very latest. So again, this was planted, and we took out our kale, just cut it right down to the ground. We didn't even remove the roots. And at this point, what I'm going to do, I like to work my beds in between each crop, but you don't have to do this. You could, if you have a tilling machine, you could use that. This is what we use because it's quick and easy, and it's non-mechanized, so no fossil fuel use. Means that anyone can use it. And what I do is I just kind of stick this in every foot or so, drive it in using my own body weight, and all I'm really doing is I'm rocking it back and forth in order to aerate the soil, because over time soil becomes compacted. So in between each planting, we go through and we just try to loosen it up. If you don't have one of these guys, you can use a regular garden fork. You can even use a shovel and turn your soil a little bit. But whatever you do, I do recommend a little bit of aeration, especially for root crops, especially important. So carrots and beets, rutabaga, all of those, they like really loose soil. All right. So just about done. I'm going to do a few more passes right here and get right at this edge. And this, by the way, does depend a little bit on what kind of soil you have. If you have extremely sandy soils, you might not really need to do this all the time. You might need to do it just in the spring in your first crop and then not have to do it again until the next year. But we have really heavy soil, so I like to do this in between each plant. Okay. Great. So that's all set. Again, that's called a broad fork if you're interested. So I'm going to put down a little bit of granular organic fertilizer. Zucchini and summer squash are pretty heavy feeders. So we're going to put down a little bit. This is North Country ProGrow. It's got chicken manure and alfalfa meal and all sorts of other things. Lots of minerals. So I wouldn't do this for a light feeder this time of year, but you're putting down a heavy feeder. And I kind of just have a ballpark of how much we need. It's not essential. Again, if you've been really caring for your soil, if you have good fertility, you get away without using fertilizer this time of year. Certainly doesn't hurt. You definitely recommend organic fertilizer. Synthetic fertilizer is completely different and can cause a lot of downstream impacts. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and rake this bed. And by the way, I should mention, oh, you know what, before I do that, I'm just going to go ahead and quickly, I noticed there are some weeds here. So I'm just going to quickly take my scuffle hoe and just go through that top 2 inches, uproot any weeds that might be growing, because I certainly don't want them competing with our tender young zucchini plants, summer squash. There we go. It's a nice dry day, great day for weeding. These plants will no longer be an issue. All right, excellent. Got them all. You can see there's a root from one of our previous kale plants that was here. All right, excellent. So at this point, I'm just going to go ahead and make a furrow. I could rake this, but actually it's fairly, you know what, I'll give it a quick rake just to even it out a little bit. And also to incorporate that fertilizer, it's good to rake it a little bit. Just working that fertilizer in that top few inches. You don't need to get it deep down. The rain, the microbes, the earthworms, they'll do that for us. Now you can see there are a lot of roots in there. If I was going to be planting a finely seeded plant like carrots, I would probably take those out. But I'm going to leave them in here because that's additional organic matter. That's food for the soil food web. So I don't mind having them in there at all. Okay, great. So now I want to make a furrow. I'm going to make one right down the center of my bed. Zucchini and summer squash, for those who have grown them, extremely vigorous plants. So this side here, I'm just using a regular peasant hoe and just going down. Probably do straighter line, okay? Furrow that's roughly a couple inches deep, where I'm going to put my seed. That will help guide me. Okay. Figure that out later. Let's just do this. We'll do the top half of the bed. Even out just a little more. Okay. Great. So let's put our seed in. I'll start with this Costata Romanesco. It's one of my favorite zucchinis. Some zucchini are just flavorless, you know? And we all know that there's usually too much zucchini. So I personally go for the really interesting heirloom varieties of zucchini because they tend to have more flavor. You don't really care so much about production with zucchini because they tend to overproduce anyway. So go for flavor, go for unique varieties. You won't be disappointed. I'm going to place these every foot or so. And eventually I'm going to thin these out to 1 every 2 feet. So eventually, you know, I'm assuming that some of these are not going to germinate. So I'll be able to thin them out. But in the meantime, I want to roughly put this once every But that's that variety.
55.
I'm going to do the other ones shortly after this video, but the last thing I want to mention, after I cover up this furrow, mark where I thought, cut up to there, I'm going to cover this back up, nice and easy. So the real trick with getting plants started in summer is water, right? If a plant is not evenly watered, they often have trouble germinating. A little bit less true for summer squash and zucchini. They tend to be pretty good germinators, but carrots and beets have a lot of trouble germinating. So one thing that we've been doing to really get a good jump on germination is using mulch. And you can either use straw mulch, nice, thin, fairly thin layer, should do fine, to just keep the moisture in. Or you can use remay if you have that available. It's just a row cover. And all we're gonna do, I'm gonna use this one here, it's a little thinner. I'm just gonna go through after I'm done, and I'm gonna cover this bed and weigh it down with some rocks. And after go through, it'll provide a really nice mulch. That's gonna keep a lot of moisture in the ground. And that has really helped our germination, particularly of carrots and beets. And I'll show you real quick as we're concluding. So we just started some plants here. This is some beets that we started last week. And we did have them covered with remay. You can see the beets are growing quite well at this point. There's just a few spots that they didn't germinate well, but mostly they're pretty nice.
Nice.
We've thinned them out a little bit. We've also got some cucumbers that, again, were started about a week ago. See those coming up right here. So now is a great time to be putting plants in the ground, but you really have to monitor moisture. That's really the key, because it's so easy for plants to dry out. And if they get a little bit moist and then dry, those seeds are no longer going to be viable. So make sure you tend to either watering very regularly, seeding only before you're sure you're going to get a really good drenching rain, or covering with mulch of some kind, whether it's remay or straw or hay. So I would definitely recommend one of those. So with that, I want to say thank you all so much. I don't know if we have time for any questions, but I'm happy to take questions as always.
Does anybody have any final questions for Dan? Thank you so much, Dan and Tyler. Such great information.